Hello and welcome to this session called Outcomes of Bullying. My name is Julia Hovendal and I'm honored to be your host during this 55 minutes. We will listen to three different speakers who will each hold a 15 minutes presentation. And during the last 10 minutes or so, this session you will be able to ask questions. Every participating online, you have a Q&A that you can use and ask questions. And please specify which person you want to addressing the question, so we know. And if you're here in this room, you have a QR code right there. So you use that for asking questions. And now let me welcome and introduce our first speaker, Ylva Bjareld, Lily Augustine, and Russell Turner. And their presentation is called Bullying and its Relationship with Mental Health in School Children, with a special focus on children with disabilities. Welcome.
Thank you. So my name is Ylva, and I'm here with Lily and Russell to present a project that we have been working on together. And this project started in 2019 and is funded by the Public Health Agency in Sweden. And the results from this project will be presented in a report that is launched in February 2022. This project have an overall aim that is to increase knowledge about bullying victimization, with a special focus on mental health and disability. And today we will present three different parts of this project. And the first part in this project is the short title, The Associations Between Self-Reported Psychosomatic Complaints and Bullying Victimization and Disability among Adolescents in Finland and Sweden. And the background to this project is that we know from previous research that bullying victimization is associated with psychosomatic complaints. And we also know that disability is associated with psychosomatic complaints. And there is research that suggests that positive relations to adults, positive relations to your parents and to your teachers can modify these associations. So meaning that a child that is being bullied have a higher likelihood to have psychosomatic complaints. But if the child also have good relations to adults, this could potentially modify the association so that the risk for psychosomatic complaints is lower. And in this research project, we try to investigate children that are being bullied and have a disability, the combination of these two, and the relation to psychosomatic complaints. And we also investigate whether positive relations to adults, whether they modify these associations. So the aim was to analyze how bullying victimization and disability were associated with self-reported psychosomatic complaints in adolescents, and if family and teacher support affected the associations. So the data in this study came from the Swedish and Finnish Health Behavior in School-Age Children survey, the two most recent survey waves that was carried out in 2013-14 and in 2017-18. So in this questionnaire, just over 16,000 adolescents between 11 and 15 years old have answered questions on bullying and psychosomatic complaints and disability. And what we could see from the descriptive analysis was that children that were bullied and had a disability, they were most likely to also have psychosomatic complaints. So in Sweden, just about 80%, and in Finland, just over 70% of the children belonging to this group also had psychosomatic complaints, meaning that they had 2 or more psychosomatic complaints. We could also see that children that were only bullied or only had a disability, they also had higher prevalence of psychosomatic complaints than the reference group. And the reference group are children that were not bullied and did not have a disability. And as I mentioned, we also wanted to investigate whether their relations to adults possibly could justify the associations to psychosomatic complaints. And we investigated that in a regression model that is maybe not so fancy to look at, but the main take-home message from this regression model is that the psychosomatic complaints, they remained also after adjusting for the relations to adults. But we could see in step 1 that the psychosomatic complaints, the odds for having psychosomatic complaints are much higher, especially in the group of bullied and in the groups of children that are both bullied and have a disability, than they are in step 2 when we are adjusting for the positive relations to adults. So in short, we could say that the results indicate that children that are being bullied and have a disability, if they have a good relation to the teacher, this can make their likelihood, their odds to have psychosomatic complaints lower. So healthy relations to teacher can be maybe a protective factor. And now I leave over to Lily.
Thank you. So we continued this discussion with actually looking at previous literature, doing a limited systematic review to actually look at long-term relations between having a disability or an impairment and being bullied, and later on then having mental health problems or additional mental health problems. So we simply want to see if do children with early symptoms of mental health problems or having a diagnosed disability, so we're looking at impairment or disability, will they also have a higher risk of being, if they're bullied, will they also have additional mental health problems above that? So we knew from the previous study that they were higher risk. So we did PICO. I will not go into that because then all the time will sort of disappear. But we simply looked at children with disabilities that were bullied and peer victimized. We compared them with those that were not bullied or had a disability but not bullied, or children that were bullied and not having it. So the same type of groups that in the previous study. And then we looked at both internalizing and externalizing. So, simplifying, disability or early difficulties, then being subjected to peer victimization, and then mental health problems. So 3 steps. So, if we look at initial difficulties, you see on the left side, those that had the first point of measure before 10 years of age. And on the right side, if they had the first point of measure after 10 years of age, so they were more the adolescent group. So we have the early group and then having a later group. So and then we have internalizing and externalizing or diagnosed as their impairment. So we have 2 types of impairment groups and a disability. I know this probably be a bit difficult, but still. And then we see in the early group, we do see that having internalizing symptoms, externalizing or a diagnosis, actually more studies indicate that you will have mental health problems, while the evidence in the later disability do not indicate this as much. And if we look at the outcomes, we do see that it's primarily internalizing symptoms that we can find support for. And specifically, actually, this depression and anxiety, not so much, but suicide or self-harming and functional disabilities. So that was very briefly. I will let you go to, because we disappeared to the next. My time just disappeared, I'm sorry. So we did find having disability increased the risk for victimization and health problem. There were stronger risk for those focusing on younger children. There were lack of studies in the older group actually looking at externalizing symptoms, and there were clear evidence of a double vulnerability when bullying and disability interacted. So, thank you. It sort of feels, is it your turn?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'll have to whiz through this very fast because we're almost running out of time. So our third study was building on the literature review and the works from the first study. We wanted to look at the developmental relations between bullying, victimization, mental health, and having a disability or chronic condition. We know from previous research that there's a bidirectional relationship between emotional symptoms like anxiety and depression and bullying. There's a general trend in adolescence that emotional symptoms tend to go up and bullying tends to go down. We don't quite know how these relations, what they look like during adolescence, how these two things affect each other. Some kids continue to be bullied even though the general trend goes down at a group level and the general trend goes up at a group level. But how do things look at the individual level? Some children continue to get bullied. Some children continue to have emotional problems. We know that disability is a strong risk factor for continued bullying, victimization, disability or chronic condition. So very briefly, we used a longitudinal data set from Sweden where we had the same children, a cohort study, so age 13, 15 and 17. We followed them during adolescence. And I won't explain the statistical models because they take too long to explain, but if you're interested in random intercept cross-lag pattern models, come and find me in the break. So very briefly, the models look like this. First thing to say is the models didn't work the same for boys and girls. There was a slight difference. So this first model I present is for girls. These are the so-called within-person parameters. So trying to estimate how things look at the individual level, not at the group process level. And you see on the top row here, BV, bullying, victimization, age, the ellipses, so 13, 15, age 17. So continue, you're bullied at age 13 and a girl, increased risk you'll be bullied 2 years later. This effect disappears when you're 17. There's a strong within-time correlation. So you're bullied at 13, like also to have emotional symptoms. Thanks. But does one thing cause the other? Or does one thing lead to the other? So this, like the arrow going over from bullying at time 1 when you're 13 to emotional symptoms at age 15. For girls, we saw this crossover effect. So increased risk of being bullied even 2 years later. So I'm going to jump to boys now. It's a slightly different model, which I won't go into. We didn't see the same crossover effect here for boys. What we did see was an increased risk of bullying between ages 13, 15, and 17 for boys, a continued effect of being bullied. Also for emotional symptoms for boys, the effect continued on up to age 17. We didn't see it for girls earlier on, but for girls you saw it between age 15 and 17. And so this is just looking at the link between bullying and emotional symptoms. So we're going to bring in now disability as a predictor. So the model gets even more complicated. So you have DCC, disability or chronic condition at age 13. That was a predictor of both bullying at age 13 and emotional symptoms. So if you have a disability or chronic condition, higher likelihood you're going to be bullied and have emotional symptoms. This effect weakened by age 15 for bullying, but still there, disappeared by age 17. So the window of opportunity for interventions is early. If you have a disability, increased risk of having emotional symptoms throughout adolescence. The effect weakens during adolescence, but it continues on. So for kids with a disability, increased risk of being bullied and increased risk of higher emotional problems throughout adolescence. So I've got 50 seconds. Quick implications. Teens with a disability or chronic condition more likely to be bullied in early to mid-adolescence. So for interventions, early interventions, more focused efforts to tackle bullying. Interventions tend to be geared towards kind of the normative adolescent, possibly not geared up for kids with disabilities, all different kinds of disabilities, harder to access parental support, harder to access teacher support that Ylva mentioned. So perhaps more focused efforts on for kids with disabilities. Bullied teens with disability more likely to have psychosomatic complaints than their peers. more work needed to decrease psychosomatic complaints, again, perhaps with a special focus on teens with a disability or chronic condition. How do they access strong or healthy relations with adults? And from the models, we found that there's more heterogeneity, we think, around girls. Girls have more difference than perhaps boys do with respect to the development of bullying and emotional symptoms. So if this is the case, we don't know, but we think it might be, then maybe we need more differentiated responses. Teens aren't one and the same thing. There isn't an average teen, isn't an average girl, perhaps an average boy. So how do we make our responses more differentiated is the question. Thank you.
All right, thank you all for being here in Sweden, and thank you over there somewhere in the world. Today I'm going to present the results of our study, the role of the perceived impact of childhood and adolescent bullying victimization in young adults' well-being across national investigation. And I've conducted this study together with my dear colleagues Hedy van den Bos from the University of Antwerp, but also with Francine de Hu and Treintje Veulink of the Open University of Heerlen. And I'm an assistant professor at the University of Antwerp, but also at Tilburg University. As we all know, cyberbullying and traditional bullying is a pervasive problem. There's a certain amount of children that are attacked every day, and this can have long-term impact on their lives. We know that if you're being bullied, it can have an immediate impact on your life with regard to mental health and well-being. For instance, you feel depressed right away, but it can also have long-term consequences. So even a week after being bullied, or a month, or several months, or even years after being bullied. Now, for traditional bullying, we really know that there's a long-term impact. So we know that if you were bullied during childhood or adolescence, on the playground, that this can have a long-term effect on your mental health and well-being, even if you're an adult. But for cyberbullying, we're not sure yet. What is interesting is that the emerging adults of today are actually the first generation that could have been victimized both online and offline when they were a child or adolescent. So that's why we really wanted to focus on this group, young adults between the age of 18 and 26 years old. And we wanted to see whether the fact that you've been bullied both online and offline can have long-term consequences in terms of mental health and well-being. And in our study, we wanted to focus on the subjective or the perceived impact. Well, cognitive theorists have indicated that the perceived impact or the meaning the event has to the individual might be a good predictor of long-term outcomes. So instead of looking at more objective measurements like the frequency, how often you were bullied during childhood or adolescence, or how severe you were bullied, we looked at the impact. What does it mean for you today as an adult? How has those events that happened during childhood and adolescence, how they still have an impact on your life today? And we did this with a retrospective model. We did a retrospective survey, and we included multiple variables. So we wanted to investigate the perceived impact, and we focused both on the negative impact and the perceived positive impact. We also included more objective measurements, namely bullying victimization intensity. It refers to how severely you were bullied during childhood or adolescence. And then we included 3 mental health and well-being indicators, namely self-esteem, social interaction, anxiety, and life satisfaction. Our study was a cross-national study, so we included 2 samples, a Belgian sample and a Dutch sample. In Belgium, we had a bit more, a bigger sample, so we had more than 1,000 adults aged 18 to 26. And in the Netherlands, we had about 650 adults. Same age group. All of them were victimized during childhood and adolescence. Well, not all of them, 63% in the Belgian sample and 48% in the Dutch sample. But for calculating our model, we focused on those that were victimized, because we really wanted to investigate the perceived impact, and of course that is not possible among those who were not bullied. That brings me to the results. I will go through this model together with you. So first of all, we have bullying victimization intensity, what we call the more objective indicator of how often you were bullied and how intense that was. And this was related to the perceived impact, the impact the events have on your life today. So we saw both a positive relationship between bullying victimization intensity with a perceived negative impact, but also with positive impact. So if you were bullied more intense during childhood and adolescence, you perceived a higher negative impact, but you also perceived a higher positive impact. So that was interesting, we thought. And then, but you see that the relationship was not significant. So in the next analysis, we also focused more on the perceived negative impact. But let me first say something about the relationship between impact and mental health and well-being. So we saw that if you perceive a higher negative impact, it was related to lower levels of self-esteem, higher levels of social interaction anxiety, and lower levels of life satisfaction, whereas a higher perceived positive impact was positively related to self-esteem, so higher levels of self-esteem, lower levels of social interaction anxiety, and higher levels of life satisfaction. Now, we were interested whether the perceived impact could explain the relationship between intensity and the mental health and well-being indicators, because previous literature found relationships between the more objective indicator, frequency, for instance, and mental health and well-being. But we thought maybe this relationship could be explained by the perceived impact. And indeed, the perceived negative impact fully mediated the relationship between bullying victimization intensity and self-esteem, social interaction anxiety, and life satisfaction. And so that relationship between how often you were bullied and your mental health and well-being during adulthood can be explained by the impacts, your perceived impact, how you look today at those events. We calculated the same model also for the Netherlands, and there we have found the exact same relationships. So we were very happy about that, because it indicates that our model is probably also generalized or can be generalized to other countries as well. So that's good. Now, in our retrospective study, we did not only gather quantitative data, we also collected some qualitative data. We included some open questions because we were curious about that perceived impact, or what does it mean exactly for the people, and we asked them to describe the perceived impact, both the positive impact and the negative impact. And when we analyzed our data, there were three themes that emerged. First of all, there was the impact on your social functioning today, the impact on your personality and self-image, but also on your health. And with regard to social functioning, for instance, negative impact, some examples were, for instance, I avoid group interactions, I have more difficulties with forming new friendships, I'm afraid that others will exclude me, I'm afraid that others will gossip about me, and so on. Negative impact with regard to personality and self-image, some examples. I'm more insecure, I'm more shy, I'm more aggressive, I lack confidence, I have low levels of self-esteem, and I'm unsatisfied with myself. There was also a negative impact with regard to health. Some said, I have more stress, I'm more anxious, I'm more lonely and depressed, I have an eating disorder, or I have suicidal thoughts. There was also positive impact. With regard to social functioning, some said, now when I interact with others, I pay more attention to others, I try to respect them more and treat them better. Others said, I'm better at defending myself, and that's something positive. I'm more assertive, and so on. Positive impact on personality and self-image. Some examples, I'm more self-assured, I have more self-esteem, I'm more resilient, I'm stronger, and I have the feeling that I have a thicker skin. And then finally, positive impact on health. People said, I have the feeling that I'm mentally stronger. And somebody else said, I think that I'm now more, being more physically stronger because the negative experiences, they really motivated me for keeping in shape. All right. And that brings me already to the end of my presentation. I still have 5 minutes, so more time for the others. Thank you very much.
So I'm here today to talk about a project we've been working on, looking at outcomes of bullying, but maybe in a slightly different way than we've been listening to today. So this project is about empathy. Empathy is defined as the awareness, understanding, and sharing of another's emotional state. And most of the research distinguishes two different types of empathy. So we have affective empathy, which is an emotional reaction that it corresponds to someone else's experience. So either feeling the same way someone else feels, how you imagine someone else might feel, or feeling concern for them, but really based on someone else's experience. And then cognitive empathy is understanding the feelings of someone else. We know that empathy from decades of research is associated or positively associated with all different kinds of pro-social behavior, helping, volunteering, donating to charity, things like that. And it's also positively associated with defending victims of bullying. And because of this reason, it's considered to be a really important part of most anti-bullying intervention curriculums is to help to raise empathy of non-bullied children for those who are bullied. So in the current study, we also used a bidirectional model, and we had two main research questions. So first, we wanted to know, does peer victimization contribute to greater or worse understanding of and appreciation of others' suffering? So in this case, basically, do victims have more empathy for other victims? And the second question we considered was, does empathy either increase or decrease the risk for peer victimization over time? So a little bit about why we approach this question this way. So most of the research, as we know, is focused on some of the negative outcomes of bullying, but we were curious if there are any, kind of in the previous talk, positive impacts of bullying on those who are victimized. The previous research findings, I won't go into detail. I spent about 6 months reviewing this literature, and let's just say the findings are mixed. And one of the reasons for this is that there are very few longitudinal studies, so most of the work has been correlational. But there are some good reasons to expect that victimization might increase empathy. For example, perceived similarity, or the degree to which you think you are similar to someone else, is a common explanation for why people think you would feel more empathy for someone else, because you are more like them. And in fact, sharing the same negative experience as someone else, for example, grief or loss, has been positively related to increased empathic concern for those people you shared the experience with. And one longitudinal study has shown that adolescents, they distinguished between different trajectories of empathy during adolescence and found that youth who had increasing affective empathy in their adolescent years also were more likely to have experienced victimization when they were children. So there's some evidence for this potential hypothesis. But we also considered whether or not victimization might decrease empathy for other children. So there's two reasons we thought this might occur. One is that being bullied might make you think other peers are hostile and untrustworthy. And in fact, one study by Malti and colleagues found that in kindergarten, children who were bullied more often over the course of their first year of school had less empathic concern at the end of the year for other victims of bullying. Another reason that victimization might decrease empathy is that it might be an empathy skill deficit. That is, children who are bullied tend to have fewer friendships, which means they may have fewer chances to practice empathy, practice expressing empathy for others' peers. And there's one study that has shown that victims who are also very aggressive are reported to have less or be less sensitive to others' emotions by their parents. So maybe there's actually a skill deficit here that would be good to know about. Regarding our second question, could empathy increase the risk for victimization? Empathy has been described as a risky strength, this kind of touchy-feely, caring about other people's emotions. Maybe that makes you more vulnerable to victimization by peers. However, it's possible that empathy could actually protect you from being victimized. So we know that empathy is positively associated with other social emotional skills and positive peer relationships. So maybe it actually helps protect you from being bullied because you have these good skills, you have better relationships. So we explored all possible directional paths. Our data that we used was from the Kiva RCT study, and we included both intervention and control schools. And we had about half of our sample was elementary students, half secondary, and about half of our sample was female. So I am going to explain what a random intercept cross-leg panel model is, because when we started this project, I did not know this. So I will take a moment to explain it for you in case you, like me, this is new for you. So we were interested in whether with in-person change over time between these two variables, whether we could see any associations between them. So like a traditional cross-leg panel model, data is collected on all variables across waves or panels. But the difference with a random intercept model is that we create this latent variable, which represents a person's average within-person score for each of the variables we're interested in. And then each person is compared to their own average across time. So whether you are above or below your own average score in one variable, is that correlated with your score? Are you above or below in the other variable? So we could examine, with like with a traditional cross-leg panel model, whether deviations from your own average are correlated within each time. And we can also look at changes across time. So our measures for this study, we looked at two types of empathy, cognitive and affective empathy. But specifically, we looked at empathy for other victims, whereas previous research has mostly focused on empathy as a general trait. We wanted to know specifically, do you care more about other victims of bullying? And we also considered both peer-reported victimization and self-reported victimization in separate cross-leg panel models. So just to briefly look at the interclass correlations, we found that there was quite a bit of variance that could be explained by within-person variation. So that was good. So these are the models, and as with the previous presentation, they are a little bit complicated, so we'll walk through them together. So first here, we're going to look at sort of the across time changes within each construct. And we'll start with self-reported victimization. So the arrows you can see here show that for all three of our constructs, there were positive associations across time, which means that if you are above or below your average at time 1, you tended to remain so at time 2 and time 3. We also found, regarding empathy specifically, that there were these cross-legged paths from affective empathy to cognitive empathy. So that means that your prior level so at time 1, if you were above your own expected average in affective empathy, you tended to be higher than your own average in cognitive empathy at time 2. So we did see this over time association, and the same was true from time 2 to time 3. We did not see the same direction from cognitive empathy to affective empathy. But what about victimization? So within time 1, we found these positive correlations between self-reported victimization and both forms of empathy, both cognitive and affective empathy. And we saw the same thing at time 2. So if you tended to be higher than your own average of victimization, then you were also higher in both forms of empathy, or vice versa, lower and lower. And then lastly, the exciting effect of the cross-legged effect of victimization on empathy. For self-reported victimization, we did see cross-legged effects from time 1 to time 2 for both cognitive empathy and affective empathy. So if you were higher in victimization than expected at time 1, you also had more empathy for victims. You both understood how they felt, and you also cared more about their well-being at time 2. So that's for self-reported victimization. We also wanted to look at peer-reported victimization because they are different forms of measuring bullying, and sometimes you get different effects. And in fact, we did find that we didn't see the exact same pattern here. So what I'm highlighting here is all of the across-time correlations were pretty much the same, but for peer-reported victimization and empathy, we only found a within-person correlation between peer-reported victimization and cognitive empathy at time 1. So we didn't see that same association with affective empathy when we measured it using victimization using peer report. And across time, we found only an association between peer-reported victimization and cognitive empathy, again, from time 1 to time 2. So that was a lot of models, the arrows. So what does it mean? Basically, what we found is that being bullied increases empathy for other victims of bullying. So changes in both self-reported and peer-reported victimization were associated with changes in cognitive empathy. So students feeling like they know how other victims feel, which makes sense because they've been through it themselves. But only self-reported victimization was positively associated with changes in affective empathy, or feeling bad for other victims. We also saw that affective empathy predicted later cognitive empathy, which suggests that having an initial emotional arousal when hearing about other victims' stories might be important for motivating youth to take the perspective of victims. However, we didn't find any evidence of any of the other hypotheses. So there was no evidence that empathy either increases or protects from peer victimization over time. So what does that mean? we think it means it's safe for anti-bullying interventions to try to increase empathy for victims, which is great because we've been doing this for a while, because it doesn't seem to be the case that it would increase their risk for being victimized themselves. However, you might have noticed that we only found short-term effects, so there was no significant effects at time 3. So this is possible that the effects are small and that they are also short-term. And so we might need other strategies for increasing empathy. Also, it's probably not good practice to subject children to being bullied just to increase their empathy. So what else can we do? So one way we can increase empathy for others is through books and literature. So either picture books or novels, but also through theater, poetry, art, music. These are all great ways to step into the experience of someone else, put yourself in their shoes, and take on their perspective, and a way to practice expressing empathy without putting yourself in harm's way. Anti-bullying interventions use different strategies for increasing empathy, like exposing children to the stories of victims, role-playing activities, and emotional awareness activities, which have been shown to be positively impact empathy for victims. And finally, this is kind of a new and exciting possibility, is virtual reality simulation, so using technology to actually put youth in the experience of the victim, expose them to some sort of mild victimization situation from the perspective of the person who is being bullied to see if that will actually help them better understand the experiences of real-life victims. And this is some work that we're going to be taking on in the next couple of years at Invest, so stay tuned for that. And that's everything I have to share with you today. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Now I would like all the speakers to come down on the stage again. Because now it's time for the last part of this session, which is the Q&A. So if you have a question, please send it in. So we can take the first question, and it goes to Lily. The time ran out very fast during your slide with your findings. So can you please take a minute or two and explain your most important findings from your study, please?
Well, thank you. I think the most important finding were actually that when we looked at the children that were bullied when they were younger, we saw a very clear pattern from externalizing behavior and then getting bullied and then getting additional internalizing symptoms. I thought that was very interesting. We did see that also when the children that actually had different NPD and what would be the NPF, neuropsychological disabilities, they did have the same kind of symptoms. When we looked at the older group, they were actually lacking that type of studies, and that's also an important, that actually start in externalizing symptoms and then looking at being bullied and then at addition. There simply were just one study and that one didn't show up to see any differences. But I do think that even if we know that victims have more internalizing symptoms, we also know that actually behavior and emotional regulations increases the risk for being bullied, or at least there were several studies that showed that earlier also being like depressed increased the risk of being bullied, and being bullied increased the risk of being depressed. So you got this bidirectional kind of relation. So I think that was very important and things to continue with.
Thank you so much for your answer. The next question goes to Sarah. What can adults do if they know a child or young adult is being bullied via social media, for example? Do you have an advice based on your study?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I forgot to mention that the paper got accepted last week for the journal Aggressive Behavior. And in that paper, we formulate some advices, things that you can do as an adult if you were bullied. And one of the suggestions that we gave is expressive writing. Maybe you've heard of it before. So it seems like a very good technique if you can write down your experiences, your negative experiences down, it can really help you to shake it off, like literally. And also it can help you to reattribute, because many adults they believe that they were bullied because something that they did themselves. They blame themselves. So if you can write it down, it can also help you to think about it, and also perhaps that you can see that it was not your fault, that something else was the reason why the bullying happened.
Thank you so much. And now we have a question for Jessica. Do you have one important thing you want us in the audience to take with us from your study?
Just one.
Just one.
Oh gosh.
You can take.
That's a tough question. I guess I would say that obviously being bullied is a negative life experience and not something we want to put on anyone, or we're trying to stop bullying, not create more of it. But to understand the experiences of bullying, that there might be some positive outcomes of it, and to fully allow children to explore all aspects of their victimization experiences and understand how going through something difficult or negative can actually make you more caring and possibly more likely to help others in the future. I think that's a really important thing to know.
Thank you. And the next question goes to Ylva. Could you define your term disability, please? How was someone categorized as having a disability? Is it physical, mental? Please.
Well, we used the HBSC data survey, and in that there was a question that the child should answer if they had any long-term disability, illness, or chronic condition. And if the children answered yes on that question, they also had a follow-up question if that condition affected them in their participation in the school. And if they also answered yes on that question, then we categorized these children as having a disability. Later in the presentation, we also talk about disability and chronic condition. And in the article that we are writing on this, we evolved the definition a bit. So we say that disability is it's a short form, but we know that this is also a bit complicated because there is a large variation of disability, children with disability, and some children have stronger associations, depending on the disability, to psychosomatic complaints. But by restricting the measurement also to that it has an impact on the attendance in school, we think that it was enough to work with.
Thank you so much. The next question goes to Sarah again. Why aren't you sure about the effects after being cyberbullied, but you are sure about the effect after being physical bullied? Don't you think it's the same thing?
Oh yeah, I can hear. Yeah, that's a good question. I think there are some differences between traditional bullying and cyberbullying, like the fact that you can be attacked 24/7. I think this is a characteristic of cyberbullying that can also be related to the outcomes that come out of cyberbullying, the feeling that you are never safe. Also the fact that the perpetrator can act anonymously, so that the victim does not know who is attacking him or her. That's also, I think, an aspect that is really frustrating or that is really difficult for the victim. If you do not know who's attacking you, that can also make it harder to do something about it. So we believe that there are some clear differences between traditional bullying and cyberbullying, and therefore we really wanted to do this study. But in our study, all our adults that were included were both victimized online and offline. We did not compare them because there were a lot of differences between them. Well, most of them were victimized both online and offline. We had a few that were victimized only online. We had a few that were victimized only offline, but in our total sample, but it was the numbers were too little to really being able to compare them. So it seems that youngsters today are not only victimized purely offline or purely online, I would say they are victimized in both contexts.
Thank you. And we take the last question to Russell. And it's the same question that I asked Sarah before. Do you have one important thing you want us in the audience to take with us from your study? Please.
So hard to choose one thing. I guess it's thinking about what these research results mean for better interventions. And I suppose it's back to the point around what I call heterogeneity or differentiated responses, so that we might talk about interventions for children. You could think, well, what age? And our results suggested the window of opportunity is perhaps around young, kind of like junior school, 12 to 13. Also thinking about children that are different. There's a huge variation in what children need in terms of disability or in terms of gender or many other things we haven't even looked at as well. So thinking about differentiated responses, I guess, is a kind of a key takeaway message.
Thank you so much. That was the last question we had, so it's time to end the session. And I would like to say thank you so much to all the speakers, and thank you in the audience and online. I hope you enjoy the rest of this conference. Thank you so much.